Hey, Ryan.
Hello, Corey. How are you?
It's good to see you, dude.
Good to see you too.
We're talking purpose today for our third episode of Inhabit.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one.
And this is obviously no small question. This is just going to be it could be potentially just this massive sprawling conversation.
Yeah.
And there's a concept that I find really useful in terms of helping us frame and sort of navigate our way through this concept. And that is the Japanese idea of the Aiki Guy, which I always mispronounce, and I usually call it Ikigai, which I think flows a little bit better.
Yep. Yeah.
But it's called
Yeah.
the Aika Guy.
Uh-huh.
And that basically, really roughly translates as like your reason for being, or a reason to get up in the morning, is often how it's kind of characterized. And we're going to be talking about that in just a little bit. And I've got a couple graphics that will show that I think will help
Great.
kind of frame things for everyone who's watching. It's a powerful concept, I think. And what I really like about it is it, I think, meets people sort of wherever they are in their sort of self-actualization, wherever they are in terms of their relationship with their own sense of purpose. I think it helps kind of, sort of illuminate the path for people. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And first, let's maybe just talk about how important really this topic is for people.
Yeah.
I just got done doing an 8-hour conversation with Ken on gun violence. And one of the things that we talk about that came up sort of time and time again throughout our conversation was how much of our problem with gun violence is really coming from a lack of meaning and a lack of purpose that people feel in their lives, and that people are able to see sort of in the world and in the culture around them. And, it's gotten so bad. And people, I think, are struggling so much with this issue that, 2/3 of all gun-related deaths in America are through suicide. Over 70% of those are men. This is an issue that is plaguing our society, and so much of it really does seem to stem from this overall lack of meaning and purpose. And it's particularly affecting men, which to me makes a certain kind of sense because, for so long, men have come to be sort of defined by and valued for the types of value that they can create for other people sort of in the public sphere out there. And I think that men really often struggle with a sense of intrinsic value, that I am intrinsically, inherently valuable as a human being to the world, to society, to my community. And obviously, when we live in a world where, our actual real space communities are sort of being besieged on all angles, or being replaced with sort of the substitute gratifications of online community, I think that really makes this problem that much more acute.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got a clip that we'll play, Ryan, and this was excerpted from the conversation I had with Ken, where I think he frames the challenge really nicely. Should I play that now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Again, men have suicide rates that are 5 to 10 times higher than women, and that's really not a good sign. Because when it's that big a difference, it shows that one gender, one sex, is having enormous problems finding meaning in life. And that's a super problem. Yeah. Because there is this background dukkha, the suffering. And there are only two ways out of that. One is you find meaning in your life. And people like Jordan Peterson would say, well, and you find meaning through assuming responsibility. And that's fine, that's one indication. But how you actually find meaning is through contacting in all four quadrants. Yeah. So you get meaning not just from your own agency and you're all by yourself and you're Superman and it's just you, because you're also part of a larger whole lot, whether you like it or not. And so you have not just agency, you have communion. And the more communion you have with people, the better you feel about life. The studies on this are crystal clear. The studies also show that starting in the 60s, that kind of communion started to break. And a Harvard professor wrote a fairly famous book, Bowling Alone, because that's what started to happen, is communions just started to dissolve, and you're left with just your own broken agency, your own isolated, set apart agency. It's hard to find meaning under those circumstances. It's hard to find purpose. It's hard to be successful because you're not even sure which way to go. And those are reasons that men do have 5 to 10 times the suicide rate of women. And it's an indicator of how society actually is treating men.
So there we go.
Great. Very great. Good clip.
Yeah, it was nice. It was sort of a nice encapsulation of the problem. And of course, you know, Ken, in this particular clip right here, he's really emphasizing, you know, how this lands for men. But obviously this is not a gendered problem. I mean, everyone is struggling to find a sense of purpose, a sense of higher calling, a sense of, you know, how do I fit into the bigger picture of the world and everything else. So it's a big challenge, and we're starting to see, I think, the results, the really, really painful results of what happens when a society has been sort of dissociated from a real sense of meaning and purpose.
Yeah, I can't remember who said this recently from a podcast, maybe from one of the sort of integral modernist folks, but characterizing the crisis, global crisis, meta crisis that we're in as one of a crisis of meaning, at least underlying it. But I think what's interesting is so many of the crises we're experiencing right now, the surface level, not to say light surface, but, you know, just the manifestation of these problems are so intense that it's hard to sense that lack of meaning underneath it all. That's either the main contributing factor, or at least an accompanying factor that we have to reckon with. It's hard to sense that because meaning isn't, you can't see it with your eyes. You know, it can't make sense of it. So we're looking at climate crisis, you know, or automation in, you know, this post-capitalist emerging world. It's like, well, how does meaning relate to that? How does it factor? I think the lack of meaning is permeating the modern world pretty significantly. And Ken, I think, points out to me, he said something in there about touching all the quadrants, right? And for me, there's a sense of the development, the evolution of what meaning making is. So I think we have to talk about that, of like, there's an assumption of like, what is meaning? So first of all, we have to talk about what is meaning. And again, I don't think that's so, and purpose, meaning, whichever word you want to use, that's not so easy to define, you know? That's really difficult. Yet I think we all intuitively, viscerally feel something when we say that word. We're all kind of in the ballpark, but that changes. So for example, you know, in more sociocentric culture, we have our meaning dictated to us. And it's like, well, it means taking care of your family. It means working hard. It means doing this kind of thing. And what's interesting is, and as long as you're doing that, then you feel purpose, and that's real. Even if, I think that's what's fascinating to me around meaning is, like, in this, say in the United States here, we can see these different layers of our cultural evolution, and the higher we get through the development, we can look down and be like, oh, right, those darn, you know, sociocentric, mythological, mytho-rational Christians. It's the thing is, like, but what happens when you take that away, you dismantle and deconstruct that, which is necessary to evolve to, say, a more fully rational perspective, which the world needs if we're going to solve things like climate change, right?
Yep.
But what happens when that version of meaning is taken away? How does new meaning arise? How does one make sense out of their life and say, what's my purpose now that it's not what I thought it was, or that's what people are telling me? And then, I mean, there's even more than that, because we have the rationalist sort of perspective, and which would be very individual, very self-authoring, like in Robert Keegan's terms. So it's like, meaning is what I make of it. Well, holy shit, that's a lot of pressure on a person, right? I gotta make all the meaning and by myself. And then that's how you get the social media stuff. You're looking at everybody else. Look at that person's life. Look at what they're accomplishing. And maybe I do it, or maybe I don't. And if I don't, well, I feel like shit. You know what I mean? And so when Ken talks about touching all the quadrants, I had written down notes for myself before I saw that clip about including the we, because when we look at that graph that we're going to show, a lot of times the questions on purpose are framed as I, right? And and it's not to say we have to go all the way to the other end and be all we's, right? Because Ken's saying wholes and parts, you know? So if we go too far to one side or the other in terms of constructing our meaning, then we generally run into some problems. But, you know, given that we're talking here to an integral audience, I think for me, that's what stands out, is how do I incorporate and integrate in my lived experience this felt sense of meaning that is both individual and collective and connected. So I think just even talking about that, we're laying this out, I wanted to, I didn't want to just leap right into like, oh, how do you get your purpose, right?
Right.
Let's get right to the step-by-step, give me my purpose so I can feel good about myself. I wanted to go take a few steps back like this. And in the clip from Ken really helps us do that, to like look at what the problem is, to look at some of the different ways we construct meaning. Because if we're not clear on that, then we're probably going to spin our wheels a lot around meaning making. And I see that a lot. I've seen that a lot in the work I've done with folks, where it's just this constant, exhausting effort to find meaning and to make meaning. And for some people, maybe it works out, and for a lot of people, they don't. And it's very demoralizing. And when we're in a society too, this is why I mentioned global crises. So if things are being automated, you don't have the purpose of like, well, I go to work and I just work really hard and I see the fruition of my labor with a bunch of other people where we accomplish something grand, you know, like back in the day with like, we built a bunch of cars and now cars are everywhere. Isn't that amazing? And I was a part of that. But you don't have that feeling anymore. So it's like all these things where a lot of people, they found meaning, some basic fundamental foundational sense of meaning through family, through work. And then, you know, for a while, this whole self-authoring thing has felt pretty nice, and this emergence of the internet, right? The gold mine of the internet. And like, what ideas do you have? Put your ideas out there online and connect with other people, and you're going to make your own Shangri-La, you know, and of your life. And then that's run its course, where it's kind of like that message of meaning kind of fucking sucks for a lot of people. It's kind of bullshit, because we're now attuning to that we part of that. We're all part of these systems, you know, more that favor certain people, and that's just because how the systems are. But we can evolve those systems too. So we can't just talk about what am I going to do to find my purpose. We also have to talk about what are we going to do, and how do we do that together. So for example, Corey, you and I are doing this show, and this is an idea that we had. So we sort of co-arose this meaning together. Right? Yep. That's lovely. So these are just some random thoughts about after seeing that clip.
Yeah, no, and I love it. And I love that you brought in sort of the developmental piece here, because, you know, in integral circles, we often talk about the difference between transformation and translation. And what that basically means is sort of our vertical health and our horizontal health. Yeah. So meaning making is part of how we translate. It's how we make sense of the world. And that changes considerably as we transform through each of these stages. So the idea is, you know, we do all this work, this inner work, and, you know, sort of we transform over time. We make it to a new stage, and that gives us a new view from sort of that rung in the ladder, and a new way, new sort of algorithms that we use in order to sort of construct meaning for ourselves. And sort of our strategies of meaning making do change considerably, you know, as this moves on. And, you know, you mentioned sort of the rational. What's interesting about the rational is that it does both sort of individualize meaning, right? As you say, in a self-authoring sort of space, it's a bigger challenge in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, it unlocks a lot of possibility in meaning, because no longer is meaning dictated and you have to fit in. And as soon as you don't start, you aren't feeling a part of this meaning, well, you're screwed. It's like you have possibility. There's more, just openness and possibility for meaning. But I also feel like at a certain point that can leave people hanging and out in the open and kind of floating out at sea.
Yeah, that's right.
Feeling a deep sense of loneliness, which makes sense. So like if development and evolution is sort of the spiraling amongst, a dichotomy of individual collective kind of feeling, well, that makes sense. You go from collective to individual and figure it out on your own, right? So that's the big message from a rational viewpoint. And an orange, is it still orange? I keep remembering
It's still orange. It is still orange, and it's individual, but it's also plugged into a more sort of universal context.
Yeah, there is more universal context, right. But inside of a capitalist system, for example, which let's be honest, at least in the United States, when people talk about meaning, and we're beyond that sociocentric kind of orientation, it's almost always in the context of business, and it's part of that. So even that graph we have includes like, what will people pay you for, right? So, and that usually goes in that direction. And if you go in that direction, then you are subject to the existing system of capitalism, and there is just a sense of every person for themselves. But you could do it, but every person for themselves. So there's these pros and cons, to to each level of development.
Well, this is meaning in the neoliberal world, right? Where my sense of value, how I'm valued in sort of a neoliberal world, depends on how much value I can generate and create for other people.
Yes, and that was one thing I wanted to unpack from that image, because I think people are feeling.
Should we show the image?
Yeah, sure. I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Go ahead and bring it up. But I think people are feeling the disappointment, the disillusionment with that way of looking at the world now. It's becoming very palpable. It took a while, right? And I saw this for myself too. It wasn't just like, I've always thought this, I was on the train too, and coming on, starting blogging back in 2003 and creating different businesses and things like that. I was definitely just all in on that kind of mindset. But we're seeing that now where things got out of control, where a lot of people are hurting, and even as hard as they want to try, you're not going to be able to extract money out of the system, because it's just not, it's not just a simple level playing field. So now we have to orient it. Well, now what am I going to do? If that way of making meaning is not viable totally by myself as an individual, I don't have all the wherewithal to change that. Well, now what do I do?
Right.
How do I make meaning? And I think that's also is to describe what is the experience of lack of meaning, right? What does that feel like in the body? What's that feel like in life? And again, it can be very hard to pinpoint these things, to articulate what is the absence, the vacuum of meaning, like not having that. And we can see symptoms of it. Like, so when Ken talks about gun violence as being part of that picture, that's one way to consider it. It was like, well, what do people do with themselves when they don't know what to do?
That's right.
Are you showing that image?
Yeah. So I'm gonna bring this up right now. So what I love about this concept, the concept of Aiki Guy, and particularly an integral sort of interpretation of it, is that it gives you a place to start. And like I said earlier, I think it meets people sort of wherever they are in their sort of developmental arc. So this right here is the classic Aiki Guy.
The classic one, yes.
What I did is, I looked at this and we'll sort of talk about all the different elements in just a moment, but I looked at it and I was like, if you kind of tilt it on its side and squint your eyes a little bit, it kind of looks like the 4 quadrants.
Yeah, I like this.
Yeah. And I like this a lot. So let's talk about what this is showing. So when it comes to the Ikigai, the basic idea is that our sense of purpose is really derived from different dimensions of our lives. And each of us, I think, probably has a piece of this with us. Again, no matter where we are in this arc, most of us are going to have a sense of something that we love, right?
Yep.
Most of us are going to have a sense of something that we're good at, or something we want to be good at, right? So what the world needs. I mean, I think all of us have a unique perception of a need that's out there that we want to meet. And then what you can be paid for. Another way to look at that, Ryan, because this is interesting. Whenever you talk about the traditional Ikigai, they always make very clear this is not just about your career and stuff like that, making money, success. It's not just about that. It's about being able to sustain an effort for any given period of time. It's about being able to have a reciprocity, an energetic reciprocity. It's about again creating value and being rewarded with value. So there's a feedback loop, I think, in there, which I think
Yes.
for most people translates as what can you be paid for. Now, sort of an interesting thing about this is, I could make the argument, you could look at this graphic and you could see something like what the world needs and what you can be paid for. We often think of money as being in the lower right. So that's why that kind of slides naturally over there. And what the world needs sounds kind of like a lower left need. But, we can make an argument that you could easily sort of switch those, because what you can be paid for is based on what do we as a collective value.
Yes.
And what type of exchange of value are we willing to sort of initiate? And then what the world needs. I mean, this isn't just intersubjective needs. I mean, what the world needs right now is dramatic systemic changes around climate change, which is mostly in the lower right. But I think that the pressure tends to build in the lower left, which is why this kind of fits so
yeah. And if we can keep this up here, I would love that, so we can point to it. So first off, I mean, I'm going to continue sort of a little bit of deconstruction on this, but I want to say that I'm also a big proponent of being real. So like right now, like capitalism, the way the world isn't going to change overnight. So that means we all got to pay bills, and the most people, even in the United States, which a country that has a lot of abundance, a lot of people are just hustling and working their asses off just to pay the bills. That's a fact. And so I don't want to be idealistic. That's the important thing, is to not be idealistic and pretend like, well, we can change what it means to exchange value. I mean, you're not going to, unless the whole system changes at once. We have to contend with the system as it is. So I think it's important to look at this graph and to answer the question, what can I be paid for? There's no way around that right now,
right?
As is. But to unpack that a little more, because I think there's such a huge gravitational pull towards that. That's been my experience in working with folks in terms of meaning. The only time that's not that is when somebody has a lot of money. So when they have a lot of privilege, and I don't use that word pejoratively, just when you got a lot of money, then you're like, stop framing meaning in terms of what I can get paid for, because you already got enough money. So then you shift your focus, and we see that a lot. So like you see like someone like Bill Gates, billionaire. Well, what did he do? He started doing philanthropy, right? So we can see that how people look at meaning and where their attention goes changes depending on where money's at. And if you're broke and can't pay bills, you're pretty much probably looking at just how you get paid, right?
That's right.
There's not enough time and energy and space to think about these other things.
That's right.
Even though they remain important. So one thing to consider, for example, in a change is a universal basic income. Now, politics aside, just think about this. Like, it's come up as a serious conversation. We have a presidential candidate who's talking about that on the debate stage, which means it's reached a significant point in the cultural conversation that we're looking at huge sums of money by like someone like Jeff Bezos being worth $100 billion. So regardless of where someone leans politically, I think most people can say we're having a conversation about how we handle abundance, And so, for example, if everybody got $10,000 to $20,000 a year, how would that change, how we look at this question of what we can get paid for, since you would already have some of your money covered?
That's right.
Now, I'm not trying to go down that rabbit hole. It's just an example of like looking at how this question of purpose might change. And if anything, just to validate the struggle that's happening now, because personally, I see a lot of imbalance in the world, and I come from blue collar farm roots from the Midwest. I'm in tune to the fact that a lot of people are just hustling, struggling to get by, right? And so if some of that was changed, then we could look at this question a little differently.
That's right.
So that's a visceral, embodied experience. That's not a cerebral experience and thoughts about this. So yeah, and to use an example from my life here. So our good friend Vince Horn pioneered a new model, I guess you'd say, of a financial model called transparent generosity. So where we're using this for our weekly, monthly group training groups for meditation and awakening. And I've started a group for that as well. And I'm using this model, and it's brilliant, where we say, here's what the suggested donation is, but here's the range of what people are donating. Some people donate $10 a month. Some people donate $150 a month. And here is the average donation. And consider what your financial situation, and also consider the value of this, and then you decide. And what's turned out, and Vince has done this for 10 months now, he ends up making the money he needs to make to be sustainable. But the whole experience is different. It becomes less transactional and it's much more heart-based, right? Because we literally are not telling, somebody does an intro with me, I'm not telling them like, you should donate this. It's just like, are you interested in this? Sign up for it. Like, just, you're part of the group, and then you're going to decide what you donate. So another example, again, just an example to unpack this model here of what you can get paid for, because paid means different things. It can mean different things. It can look differently, and it can change how you feel about it. So I personally find so much more meaning. It's so much more full in this model of transparent generosity. And it avoids some pitfalls of purely donation-based models that we've seen traditionally of Dana, and transactional, where it's like tit for tat. You pay me this and I give you that. There is a coldness about that. When we really feel in our bodies about it, how do we feel about that? If I just give from generously, like, I know I'm good at this, I know it's useful, and I say, Corey, here you go, buddy. And you say, thank you. I'm like, welcome. And then you say, you know what? I'm so appreciative. I'm going to give you something. That changes, right? How does that not change our experience of how we respond to enacting meaning and pursuing meaning? So again, I'm just discussing these things out loud just to unpack all of the feelings and experiences we have around meaning, so that hopefully some interesting questions come up for listeners. If you're listening to this, what questions arise in yourself that you can sit with that will more organically guide the process?
Yeah, Ryan, I enjoy all the sort of cautions that you're bringing to that element of the Aiki Guy.
Yes.
And I think what's important to point out, however, at the same time, is that if you have all of these other three, if you have a keen sense of what the world needs, you have a passion in something that you love, you have something that you're really good at, and you don't, if you're not able to land that in the lower right quadrant in a purposeful way, if you're not able to create, again, this basic exchange of value for your passions and for your service and for your skills, it's not very sustainable. I mean, you're going to run out of gas really quick. You're going to run either out of gas, inspiration, or simply time, because no matter what, the idea of the Aiki Guy here is that no matter what, you have to be getting paid for something, right? You need to have a job. You need, if you're going to raise a family, that you need money to do so. So everyone has to go out there and get a job. So if you're going to do that, you might as well try to make that job as purposeful, as resonant, as aligned with these other elements as you possibly can, regardless of sort of what the structure of that energetic exchange happens to be.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's why I started with the first thing I said, which is like, there's no way around this right now. You're going to have to pay your bills. I just think, like, my experience has been that, maybe you're going to know this audience better than I will, since you've been doing these shows. But I feel like usually people will grok that. I mean, that's why they're listening to the show. That's why, like, if they look at this graph and be like, hell yeah, I want to be in the center of that thing. I want to nail everything. But in terms of that lack of meaning, what happens is, I think sometimes, is if people look at this and they fail at that, especially that right-hand side, they get all the other things and they can't figure that out, they internalize that. I see it so much. It gets internalized and people beat themselves up. And then all of a sudden, maybe you actually are finding meaning and purpose in multiple areas of your life, but it's just not lining up perfectly in the job realm, people don't just stop it and saying, like, gosh, life is hard. I'm trying, I'm doing my best. I've done my best. I know it. It's just not working out, but I'm continuing forward. Instead, they go, I'm a failure. Whether that's said out loud or not, that's what happened. And so then what do you have? You start having a lack of meaning plus the feeling of failure. And then if we talk about gun violence, like Ken's conversation, that's how that train happens. So that's why, like, I'm so intent on making sure that in yourself that you that you take responsibility and say like, yeah, I got to do this. Who else is going to find your purpose? You know,
Yeah.
like you got to take that action. You got to pay your bills one way or another. And if you can really find that center and really align everything, then that's definitely what we should be going for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's well said. And what I like again about this sort of approach is that there are certain feedback loops in place, right? So if you you know, for example, are struggling to make ends meet in the lower right quadrant, you're right. You could retroflect that sort of that tension and that resentment, right? It could actually turn into sort of a hostility either towards ourselves or towards the world around us, etc. What I like about this sort of model, however, is that it gives you some other places to go first.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
if I'm not doing as well financially as I would like to, well, maybe I need to look at the upper right in terms of what am I good at, and do I need more skill development? Am I simply not as talented and capable as I thought I was, and I actually just need to sort of double down and sort of finesse my skills? Or maybe I got something wrong in the lower left, and I have this concept of what the world needs, but the way I'm holding that concept is in a way that the world is not actually actively selecting for.
Yes.
I'll say in integral land, this is one that I struggle with a lot, because I have a very deep, palpable sense that, man, the world needs integral, and yet it might not necessarily need this form of integral content, for example, that I've been trying to serve. So there's an invitation to check in with the other aspects. And the other thing too is that I just want to mention for people looking at this, because someone might look at this graphic and they might look in the very center and be like, okay, that's the bullseye, right? If I'm not nailing the very center there, I'm off the mark. What I think is really, really valuable about this is that you can be as piecemeal as you want to be. And that's why I like these overlaps, right? Where when what you love and what you're good at overlap, that creates your passion. Where what the world needs and what you love overlap, that's your mission. What the world needs and what you can be paid for, that overlap is called vocation. And vocation here literally means calling, right? That's what the word vocation means. The overlap between what you can be paid for and what you're good at is your profession. All four of these are obviously vitally important, but I think the deeper point is you're not necessarily always hitting all four of these at the same time in the same activity. So some people will have something they love over here, and it might be taking care of their family. It might be a love for animals. It could be any number of things that we just love. And, you know, maybe we love that thing and we don't care whether we make money from it, or we don't care that this is something that the world is desperately sort of calling for. The fact is, I've got that covered. I have a sense of something that I love, right? And then over here, I'm also, you know, volunteering for various charities or what have you, because that's a sense that I have of something that the world needs. And I'm working a job, and it's not a job I find tremendously meaningful, but it's paying the bills. So I've got a sense of, you know, I'm hitting that mark of I'm getting paid for something. And I know that I'm getting better at certain skills all the time, and that's always unfolding. So I think the general idea is that you can start with any one of these and build from there. Now, I think that ideally, in terms of like our overall lifelong arc of self-actualization, we're doing a better and better job of bringing these elements together in a more purposeful way, so that hopefully by the time, you know, decades from now or whatever, we are sort of hitting closer to that bullseye in the very center. But for people who are struggling with a sense of meaning, who are simply struggling to find meaning anywhere they look, what I like about this is it says, okay, check this out, choose one, just choose one thing to start with, and then you can build out from there.
Yes.
Right. So find something you and again, I think that all of us, and it probably varies sort of typologically, you know what I mean? If you're an upper right orienter, you might be more tuned in to a particular element here.
Yeah.
As an upper lefter, I tend to start with what I love, and then I have to bend everything else around that. And not everything I love, you know, a perfect example, integral for me is my Aiki Guy. Integral, for whatever reason, I was able to forge a path for myself where I do feel like I'm able to get all four of these sort of at the same time. I'm able to get them all in the same room together. And I can say my integral career is an effort to harmonize and integrate all four of these dimensions of my inner sense of purpose. However, I have other activities I enjoy. I like woodworking. I love woodworking. I don't feel a pressure to get paid for it. You know what I mean? That woodworking can still be a part of my Aika Guy without it hitting all four of these marks.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Corey. And, I'm going to say one more thing on the same track, but what I really appreciate is that, and I'm always about this, is concrete steps that you can really work with all of these. There's always concrete steps and skills you can develop that lots of people need. I mean, it's funny, sometimes this stuff comes down to real simple practices. Like, it's not rocket science or complex philosophy. It's just like, okay, I'm going to take some steps and I'm going to go through some real simple practices and processes in order to clarify each of these components, which you were talking about. But one last thing, not to belabor it, but when we're going, I think in this day and age, it's really possible to be very clear about what you love, to be very clear about what you're good at, to be very clear about what the world needs, to have the capability to enact it, and you still won't get paid for it. Mm-hmm. I think that is something that, and this is why I'm so pulling it out, because I think it's so subject to us as a culture still, but it's becoming much more apparent, is that, like, I'm saying straight up, it's really possible that you can do all three things, and it's tough shit. And I don't mean to be a negative Nelly, but I'm saying that so that way we can do something about it. Like, I'm actually go the other way. I'm like, not going to be cynical. I'm going to say, let's be real. Now let's do something. What can we do with this? And one word that came up that could transform this is, in addition to the what can I get paid for, we can also say, what kind of impact can I have?
Totally.
Because
Absolutely.
That's always possible. So, for example, you may be having significant impact on the collective world, outer world, even though the payment thing is not quite figured out. And that can be deeply meaningful, because even though I said all the sort of bad news stuff, we need good news in order to navigate and survive that. And actually, Viktor Frankl book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he was one of the pioneers to talk about existential meaning. And he wrote this book from his experiences in living through the concentration camps, of like, how does somebody sustain meaning through such horrifying conditions, and he said that this was essential. Like, you can't survive without meaning. So even in the most dim circumstances, he believed that we could find meaning, and purpose regardless, in various ways. And that's essential. So, yeah.
Well, I'll just drop there's a quote I wanted to share, which came from an author, a Japanese author named Kobayashi Tsukasa. Hopefully I got that right. And this is from an article he wrote called Aiki Guy, The Process of Allowing the Self's Possibilities to Blossom. And the quote says, people can feel real Ikigai only when, on the basis of personal maturity, the satisfaction of various desires, love and happiness, encounters with others, and a sense of the value of life, they proceed towards self-realization. And I love that, because the idea here is that, when you're really sort of in alignment with your felt sense of Ikigai, our actions aren't forced, right? They're actually able to come a bit more naturally, a bit more spontaneously, because we are naturally sort of following the curvature of our own life purpose, which part of which we are sort of creating as we go, moment to moment. And, as I was preparing for this episode, Ryan, it was really nice. The conversation was a nice way to just kind of frame things for myself. It was an opportunity to kind of, take inventory, to reflect on my own story, my own sort of hero's journey, whatever that means. And sort of the path that took me from meaninglessness to purpose. Because, when I had, and I think you and I talked about in our last episode, some of the sort of original spiritual sparks, the peak states that kind of tend to get us started on these paths. For me, that experience was one of very, very sort of depressing meaninglessness. It was like, in a flash, everything that I thought was meaningful kind of turned into cardboard, right? Kind of turned into saran wrap. Everything got very sort of thin and brittle all of a sudden. And it was sort of within that wasteland that I had to start reconstructing meaning for myself because it became increasingly obvious that the meaning that I was sort of handed down, usually unconsciously, just wasn't working for me. Right.
Yeah.
So, after that time, it's my spirituality was very much not a sort of extended love and light experience.
Yeah.
If anything, it was, sort of these turbulent dark nights that were, occasionally punctuated by things like bliss and freedom and purpose and things like that. But throughout all these up and downs, that's when I found the thing that would become, so meaningful for me, that would become this ongoing source of meaning for me. And that was Integral. I was fortunate enough to bump into Ken's work when I was at this very sort of tender and vulnerable period when I was about 19 or 20 years old. And, that was it for me. I mean, that became sort of the thing that I wanted to bend my life and my career around. And it's kind of funny because when I remember these things and I remember the decisions that I made back in my 20s, it all felt sort of like it was kind of like a Tom Robbins novel. I mean, everything was just very sort of untethered and colorful and vivid. And really just like totally imaginal. Last episode, we also talked about the difference between living in an imaginal spirituality versus a more sort of embodied and more mature spirituality. This for me was my very disembodied, very imaginal, I mean, it kind of felt like I was a pinball kind of bouncing off all of these, great big archetypes. Again, it was like a Tom Robbins novel. And then I made the decision to move to Boulder and get involved with what Ken was doing, which was a very meaningful and purpose-driven decision that I had made. And of course, I'm in my 20s where I don't have any commitments. I don't have any family. So it's a lot easier to make decisions like that. And there it kind of went from being a Tom Robbins novel to like the inside cover of a Led Zeppelin album. I mean, I mean, the first time I met Ken, I literally had to drive up a mountain, to
awesome.
meet this like wise sage that lived on top, which is just archetypal as shit right there. So it was nice for me to reflect on all this because I was able to see, in sort of how lucky I feel that, not only were the stars able to sort of align and I was able to feel those funny little synchronicities that told me I was becoming more, I guess, deeply aligned with my sense of purpose and my passion and all of that. But, also it sort of led me to creating a career for myself where I'm just constantly out of my depth, and that is purposeful, because that kind of forces me to swim sort of all the harder. I'm sort of given the space to identify my challenges. I'm given a lot of space to fuck up. I fuck up all the time. But most importantly, it's a space where I've been able to grow and I've been able to really feel into these other elements of my Aiki Guy. Because when I showed up here, I was all love. I was all passion. I didn't have much in the way of skills. I was a decent writer. That was about it. And the last 15 years since has been me sort of adding on these other elements of the Aiki Guy so that I could get to a place where I could feel like I'm beginning to pull these pieces together into, something, a more cohesive and coherent whole. So anyway, that's in a certain kind of way, my path here to sitting down here with you, in a lot of ways, it kind of feels like a magic carpet ride because things just sort of lined up. But I also don't like framing it that way because it really did take a lot of intention, a lot of passion, a lot of effort in order to get here. And that said, as sort of magic as that ride sounds, I also know that that's not everyone has a calling. Not everyone feels this palpable, like, oh, the world needs me to, you know what I mean? And I understand that. And I think the idea is that you can have an Aika Guy, you can have a felt Aika Guy without having sort of these big mythic, sort of metaphysical pieces to your narrative.
Yeah.
That was a little extended, so I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's really, and one thing that stood out to me in your journey is describing it as such a journey. Like there was an unfolding to it, of if we look at that map and the quadrants, there was like this feeling of including more through each wave, like it just got bigger and more full. And I think that's really accurate, when we look at meaning, because again, I think we've talked about this before, because this is explicitly in the integral realm. We can talk about maps in a very idealistic way, right? Like this is the pinnacle of where I want to get. And then that can be really hard because we're sort of like leaning ahead of ourselves constantly and not realizing like, these things take a little time. Like we can make a lot of sense to say, well, I want to be touching all 4 quadrants. I want to be embodying and directly experiencing all 4 quadrants, but it can also take time to be able to fully do that. But that can be like a nice map to guide us at any given moment to say, okay, in particular, what I came to my mind was like where we can bias, right? And you were saying some of this earlier, but we may be very attuned into the upper left, right? And we were very strong in that department of knowing what we're passionate about, right? But then we're very out of touch with the lower right, and we run into problems of like finances and whatnot because we don't want to pay attention to that, right? And so we say, okay, I need a balance. I need to integrate that a little bit more, and we can kind of float around depending on where we feel maybe what we're not paying attention to, or what's just needed based off the conditions, changing conditions of life. So I'm a big fan of an organic path. Like I like having the map to like situate myself, to have a reference point for understanding and reflecting. And then at that point, I like to drop in. And that was one thing I want to recommend for folks. And this isn't really a guided meditation per se, but it's a very simple technique. And Corey, we've done this before in the previous program we're a part of. But I love embodied inquiry for this kind of process. And I want to recommend to listeners to go back and listen to, say, the last episode where I guide people through an inhabiting process, inhabiting the body in a very simple way. If you do that, it's going to be much, much easier. Like for me, honestly, without some connection to the body, there's going to be some things missing. It's not like you can't do some really good, deep reflection, but when we're especially talking about purpose and how it has to hit all those quadrants, and especially enacting things in the world, body is going to be very helpful here. Yep. So the first step is you're going to inhabit the body. And again, this is to experience that you are the internal space of your body. We're not separate from it. We're not above it. And we might not fully experience the internal depth of our entire body, but just that we simply are trying to do that. We're trying to relax into this presence in our body, as our body. That's the first step. And in that meditation, we started from the feet and go up to our head, because you can do either way, obviously, but given that most of us are probably a little more top heavy in our awareness, start at the bottom and ground ourselves. Then what you can do is you simply sit and you just let yourself be quiet. And the first time you do this, it's kind of, I think, helpful to have somebody else help you a little bit, especially guiding it, but in particular, ask you a question. So one question we might have is, what does the world need, right? This is one of the things we're exploring. What do we need? And if you inhabit your body and you're sitting present and you're quiet, and I ask you, what do we need? You pay attention to the first things that spontaneously arise. It can be anything. It could be thoughts, feelings, sensations, imagery. It doesn't matter. But pay attention to whatever arises immediately, because there's going to be something very interesting in that relates to meaning. It might not be the answer. It might not be the right answer, but you're going to arrive at a visceral, embodied response to that question by starting with this. And it sounds like a very simple technique, but every single time I've done it, how quickly people have insight, especially about this very thing, purpose, is profound. And the reason why it is because normally we're so up here, we're up in our heads trying to calculate everything. And we're trying to figure it out. And we're usually ahead of ourselves. And maybe that works out. Maybe we find the right path and the right answers. But there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of exhaustion that happens in that kind of experimenting. So this simple technique of doing that, of resting, asking the question, see what arises, clear yourself again, and just inhabit, let go of everything, inhabit the body, ask the same question again, usually repeat it multiple times, or you can frame a different question. So it could be any one of those questions from that image, right? But the more open the question is, the better. So that way it elicits a organic response. So Corey, I want to see if what I'm saying making sense.
No, totally. Yeah, it's absolutely landing.
Okay. And two important steps here, and this is a bridge. One is that we're letting go. I call this release. We're releasing our ideas of the world for a moment by inhabiting our body and just sitting. What we're really doing is releasing, but we're also really present and open. So this is not a bypassing. This is just simply letting go. So rather than that, like figure it out, hyper focus, we're just relaxing, letting go. And then we're going for a response, which is tied to action. So that's why this is a bridge practice that I really love for so many things. But it's going to be more powerful when you can really sit. The more deeply you can sit in your body and in presence, the more powerful that immediate response will be. After that, I highly recommend experimentation. So like actually out in the world, Corey, as you know, and from the Embodied Success, I really encourage experimentation. So once you start getting clarity, even if it's not 100% known, start experimenting, start getting feedback from the world, make contact with the we that we are a part of to see. You don't need to figure it all out, which is a big erroneous message that people get, especially in the world of business. Figure it all out, launch the big thing that will change your life, and then maybe it works. Usually it doesn't, because you have to figure some things out. You have to experiment. So start with experimentation. Take little steps to find out what feels right for you, what seems to land with people. Have conversations, get some feedback mechanism. And this kind of creative, spontaneous experimentation will produce a lot of results to cultivating that purpose. And I would say even that process, that meditation and the experimentation itself is an experience of meaning. Immediately you experience meaning. You don't wait for meaning. You're not waiting for meaning to arise down the road.
That's right.
When you hit that bullseye, you gotta find that experience of meaning in this moment. Otherwise, it will often be delayed because, and we see this in our world, right? We see it like CEOs who have, or I'm not a huge football fan, but I do like football, and everybody's seen Antonio Brown recently and how he just, like, the Raiders let him go, and then he went to the Patriots and let him go, and he's got all these assaults charges and everything. Like, his whole world is collapsing. The guy was one of the best receivers ever, millions of dollars, and his world is collapsing around him. And we see all this stuff happen all the time with people who are incredibly successful. And I got to think somewhere there's a void of meaning, or that lack of feeling the heart and gut of their life. And so we know that you could achieve what looks like meaning, but it's not viscerally meaning for you. So that's why I really encourage, find meaning along the way, and wherever you land, you're gonna be good, and you're gonna be able to navigate it too.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said, because exercising purpose generates more purpose.
Yes.
Which is, I think, fucking profound.
Yeah.
And this is, I love everything you just said, Ryan, because it, if I can talk about myself again.
You give great examples, Corey. I appreciate it.
Well, totally. It's Ryan. It's one of the reasons, honestly, why I love doing this show with you, and why I look forward to doing the shows. It's like, I feel like with all my, a lot of the other shows I'm doing, I put this expectation on myself to be a little bit more than who I am. And with you, I can kind of be more myself, so thank you for the lowered expectations.
Good. I think that's really important for everybody. Actually, this is an important point too. Everybody's going to be unique in this, especially around the narratives and stories that we have internalized from families, from our subcultures, and those can change developmentally, right? So if we used to be part of a very achievement-oriented orange kind of culture, we would get certain messages and we take those on, and then we become part of a more collective, we focused green group, and we have different messages and we take those on, right?
Yep.
And so, but then then we have our own dispositions, right? So some people may constantly feel less than, and some other people might feel very arrogant about themselves. So how we have to orient ourselves is going to be a bit different.
Yeah.
And so I want to allow space for that for whoever's listening. Pay attention to where you're at in your life and who you are and what your background is, and find out how you might need to shift in relationship to some of these questions.
Totally. Well, yeah, because especially Ryan, if we can stop relating to integral as, which I did, I think for years, as sort of this grand destination
Yeah.
that I'm trying to reach at some point, and instead we sort of take it as, you know, sort of this ongoing iterative process of both self-acceptance and self-improvement. And
Yeah.
both are really, really necessary.
Yes. They help you, they support one another.
They totally do. And by bringing those together, that actually, I think, gives you sort of the resiliency that you need to start really pushing your own growth edge.
Yeah.
Which is where I think you really start to see results. And that's when you really, really start generating just a lot of purpose, a lot of a sense of purpose. And,
Yes.
you know, I think that this is one of the reasons why, Ryan, for, you know, for the first 15 years I was working with Integral, I really did. I tried to hide in the background as much as I could. You know, I used to say things like, I don't like to build, or I don't like to stand on stages. I like to build them for other people.
Yeah.
Which was sort of, you know, this kind of, it's a way of using false humility to get myself off the hook.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I don't want to be accountable for my flaws and my, you know, neuroses and sort of my awkward personality and, you know, all of that. I don't want to be held accountable for it. And it wasn't really until the last couple of years that I felt like I began to tap into this inner, well, again, just resiliency that allowed me to kind of turn around and start putting myself out there.
Yeah.
You know, which again, I think comes down
Yeah.
to this idea of integral as being a space for self-improvement and self-acceptance.
Yeah. This is a great example too. And compassion was a word I wrote down for this conversation as well. So self-acceptance, compassion for ourselves, because, you know, an example from my life that's similar is I used to struggle with social anxiety majorly. I mean, intensely. And I really disliked that. I didn't want to have that experience, and yet it was still very debilitating in certain ways. And so I would take on challenges, maybe not so much consciously, like, oh, I'm going to go do this challenge, but I sort of felt unconsciously I needed to do it. And like one example was I became an RA, a resident advisor, resident assistant, which is, if people don't know that, it's like the person who manages and coordinates the community of a floor in a residence hall at a university. They put on programming, things like that, enforce rules. So being an introvert with social anxiety, that was like murder. That was like the most insane thing for me to do. And to be honest, it was too much. I survived it and I got a lot from it, but it was beyond my edge. So this is the self-acceptance. It's like wherever you're at, there's going too far. Like even if you want to be further, you got to be where you're at and work with that edge enough so that way you feel purpose and meaning along the way, that you feel progress, that there's validation. Because otherwise I leaned ahead a lot too much in my 20s, and it wasn't until mid to late 20s that I really got a handle on social anxiety, being able to really work with it in a sensible way. And oh, that felt so good. The first day that I realized that that's what I was struggling with, it was a relief. And I had simple ways to work with it, but that's where I needed to work with. I couldn't do this, you know, when I was 25, that would have been horrifying.
I couldn't do this two or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Right. So that's what I meant about the personal disposition too, is, you know, embrace where you want to be in the future, but take the patience and time to walk that path. And nobody knows the answer to that. That's the thing. It's like, you and I can talk about our lives and we can kind of feel into like what's appropriate for us at any given moment, but like without seeing somebody, we don't know. There's not an answer of like, this is what you should be doing.
That's right.
You know, you got to orient and find yourself, work with other people, connect with your friends and family and people you trust to help navigate that.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the point you made about sort of how far outside of your comfort zone you go is a really, really important one, because, you know, I think a lot of people make the mistake of, you know, they get this, you know, which I did for years, just this sense of like claustrophobia, like, oh, I'm sort of trapped in this personality, and I'm trapped within this very narrow comfort zone. Yeah. And I need to find a way to go outside of that comfort zone. And I think what oftentimes people will do is they'll make just this like reckless charge, and they'll go so far outside of their own comfort zone. They'll go like 3 miles out of their comfort zone.
Yes.
And then all that creates is this backlash. And then they say to themselves, well, I'm not doing that again for the next 5 years. Right. Because it's intense and we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And a better approach is to not go 3 miles outside your comfort zone, but like 3 inches at a time, and do it like as often as you can. Just hit right on that line.
This is huge. And this is something that I feel very passionate about that. I'm just going to say I see this failed at in different spiritual relational community groups. I won't name names, but I've seen it like in
Please do.
a Boulder scene and various progressive scenes where there is an implicit assumption that by being uncomfortable, you grow, you heal. Now, there's some truth to that, but the thing is like the measurement of what is uncomfortable, that's the mistake. So for example, when I was talking about my social anxiety, the littlest thing, raising a hand in class, would have been somebody else's jumping off a building and doing a bungee cord.
Yep.
You don't know what a person's comfort level is. Each person has to feel into that, and you have to get to know somebody to know what that is. But sometimes in these communities, it'll just be like, go hard. And like, almost like the same thing you see in the gym or like with exercise, people saying like, no pain, no gain, which we know that that's crazy because the body recovers better when you have rest too, like builds muscles while you rest. So I want to let a lot of people off the hook because I feel like that's more often going to be the case, is that people don't feel like they can compassionately let themselves just rest and say like, yeah, this is my max right now. And I'm just going to work with that. You're totally good to just work with where you're at, and you'll get further really by doing that.
And quickly. I mean, that's kind of the thing about it, is that you start flexing those muscles and they start developing quickly. Now, I mean, like for example, when I started finally getting on camera, I mean, I, sort of did it as a trickle at first. I would do a couple shows with Jeff Salzman for Daily Evolver. As I kind of got, acclimated to that, I started doing shows with like Ken, doing the Ken show, which was for me at the time, that was actually probably going a little too far out of my comfort zone. And if you watch those early episodes, I'm just a freaking anxious wreck throughout the entire thing.
It's hard. Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
But I did those and I got more comfortable. So now I'm doing shows with you and with Keith and with Bina and, all this stuff. And it's not like all that stuff has gone away. I mean, I still have a panic attack every time I turn on the camera. I still walk away from 10 minutes from now when we're done this conversation, I'm going to be cringing at, oh, why did I say that thing in that way? It's still there, but it's more manageable. I can hold, it's a little lighter. I can hold it as an object of my awareness rather than being sort of tormented by it.
That's all. I think is always the case. Now it's going to be different for each person about like what things make them uncomfortable or that make them cringe about themselves, but everybody's got something. And the thing is, it's not that these things go away. It's just that, more manageable, like you said, and not as big of a deal. Like it's not a impetus, it's not an obstacle. We can work with it, and that helps things relax. And again, I think it helps people to be more responsive. I feel more responsive because I do the same thing. I've been recording stuff for a long time now, and I still am like, I want to go watch our clips here and see if there's anything I like. I want to like cut out and share. But I'm like, man, I don't want to listen to myself talk. But it's not a terrifying feeling or anything like that. It's just like, I'm not like, yay, I get to listen to myself. I don't know if that'll ever be that way, but it also doesn't matter because I can still do it. I'm going to listen to it and I'll assess something and it'll get done. That's fine. There's a progress. Do we have anybody on? I don't know if we have anybody at the moment on live who wants to ask questions. I don't know if we did that last time or not.
I don't see anyone in the Zoom app with us, but I can check on the main page.
I know that.
Just to let people know, if you do have questions that you want to ask, and if you're watching on Integral Live, right underneath the video is a link. You can click it. That'll bring you into the Zoom app. You can ask your questions there either by raising your hand or pressing the Q&A button and writing out your questions. And
we'll have a more regular schedule, I know, in the future where that might make it more possible that people are on here to ask, which we would love. But I just want to check on that. And
I should say, if you're watching this episode on the site, and you have any questions, you can write down your comments right below, and Ryan and I will pick up, any questions that you guys might have. We'll address them in a future episode. So you're really invited to do that as well.
One other thing I want to say last, just I had in my notes, is working with those questions is to work with different framing of each question, experiment with how they feel. So for example, especially when it changes so much that something in you goes, huh? What? And this isn't about getting out of our comfort zone. It's like looking at life a little differently that will produce different responses. So for example, we might say, what do I love? What do I love? That's the question. What do I love? What do I care about most in this moment? What's most important? Now we can do different things. I can frame it in what do I love most? What's most important to me right now? I can frame it in an it question. What is most important? And how does that change the question, right? What is most important? I can also say, what do we love? Which is an interesting thing because it's sort of like, it is that a little bit of that lower left thing, but the anchor point is a little different because we think, well, I got to figure out what I love. That'll be the answer, which is partly true. But what if we just said, that's not it. And we're going to say, what do we love? How does that feel? And there can be all kinds of different feelings. Like there might be like big resistance. Like maybe I've had a lot of bad experiences, with a we. And so we is kind of scary. But I can notice that, pay attention to that, pay attention to what comes up, and that there's resistance or there's trauma or something with that, right? But it could produce something different. Like maybe after this show, if I'm thinking about that, what do we love? And I'm thinking about you, Corey, well, then it might be a very happy experience. And how do I respond to that question when it's a we, when it's like you and me? What do we love? And how does that then impact my experience of meaning and finding the question? So you can play with those three things, changing the subject of the question, but also playing with different versions and flavors of the question. Take time to really sit with each one. Don't just ask it once, ask it multiple times, sit with it and then see what arises.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful instruction. And it really does. I mean, adding those perspectives really does change the flavor of the question. I mean, what does the world need versus what does the world need from me?
Yeah, all these
those
questions.
Are two such a different kind of feeling tone.
Yeah, it's with that question. One that Vince has used that he mentioned is, what's mine to do?
What's mine to do?
I love that one. Yeah. Right? That's another one. What's mine to do? How does that change things, right? What's mine to do?
Yep. And each of these, as soon as you press into it, the others light up, because all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, so when I ask the question, what is the world for me, or what is mine to do? That brings me into more alignment with this thing that I'll call a calling, right?
Yes.
What is calling me forth? Okay, I've got a sense of calling. I want to follow that calling, but that requires a certain skill set that I do not yet have. And so I need to start developing those skills. And so you start seeking out those skills.
Right. See, that was what I was talking about earlier, about that response, that natural response unfolding rather than the top down, orchestrating and then trying to follow a perfect plan. But it's just like arising, like, oh, okay, yeah. And then through the whole time, these roots deepen. Like it started with something rooted in ourselves. And as we branch out, into those experiments, like learning a skill, it's purposeful. And to give a simple example, I don't know how much longer we're going to talk, but in undergrad, one of my majors was Spanish, and I was fluent to maybe the fourth level in the European system. It's called B2 for any nerds out there, the B2 level. But then I didn't do anything with it. It was a skill I had, didn't do anything with it. About 20 years. I also did learn Tibetan, classical Tibetan. Didn't do anything with that. I love languages. And then now I'm relearning, refreshing my Spanish, but it has a different purpose.
Right.
I want it to I want to connect with more people throughout the world. I want to unlock a different we experience that I can connect. I mean, it's the second most natively spoken language in the world, fourth most for both native and second language folks. And that'll be really neat. And I can use that to teach, through my work in Awakening a Life. I could do different shows in another language. There's a purpose for it. There's a connection to it. And because of that, I have way more motivation to speak it. Whereas like, why did I learn a whole language? I got a degree in it, didn't do shit with it. Just was very much like, it wasn't like I even tried. I was just like,
Right.
So this is like when we learn a skill for just no reason versus like it's emerging out of an embodied purpose.
Right. Oh, it's beautiful. No, it's a great example. And, I think one of the last things I want to say is going back to that sort of bottom right, the lower right quadrant of what can I get paid for? What I really like about the fact that that's there and that it's framed the way it is that I think it helps sort of moderate extreme reactions on either side. You can either have this cynical side of like, oh,
Yes.
my purpose only comes from my job,
Uh-huh.
which is a very common, I think, sort of
Yes,
masculine
it
pathology
is.
that we have. And
Right.
society has structured itself in such a way to sort of reinforce that pathology. Where,
Right.
again, to go back to the beginning of the episode, a lot of men feel like this is where my purpose begins and ends.
Yes.
Everything else is sort of, secondary to like, how much wealth can I create? And if, that's a shitty place to be. On the other side, you have this idealism that says, oh, well, meaning and purpose should be completely disconnected from things like money, because that just drags me down, man.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And,
That just sort of corrupts the whole thing and makes me feel
yeah.
dirty. And it's like, okay, well, livelihood, right? Livelihood is so incredibly important. And especially if we have an opportunity to take our livelihood and bring it into some sort of alignment or resonance with the things that we love and with our skill set and all of this. I mean, isn't that better? Isn't that better?
Yeah. And again, that word impact I used earlier, like still whether it's paid impact, somehow we get to contribute externally, not, like we're not going to avoid that. And right now you got to get paid. So it's like, then that's a painful experience to be on either one of those sides. Like in this world as it is, it's going to be painful to not try to integrate all these.
I got a mortgage, brother.
Yeah, that's why you got to pay the bills, man. Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, speaking of that, the like being real, another good reason that I was like, I'll refresh my Spanish. First, it was that motivation, that deep purpose of like, how does this connect? I'm good at it. I love it. It'll open me up to deeper connections in the world culturally. And, but I was like, you know what? It'll also just provide more value in what I get paid for. Like all is true at the same time. But if I had just done it just like, oh, well, I can get paid for it. How can you accomplish anything that requires a lot of commitment over time when it's just to get paid? Not going to happen. It's going to be harder.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, it's well said. It's well said. So I'm going to show this graphic just one more time to leave people with, and then, basically an invitation. And here's what I would invite people to do. Ryan, you laid out the process earlier of, get into a nice meditative space, a nice embodied space where you can access sort of your bodily wisdom, and so that you can track sort of what your natural, spontaneous, organic responses are to any of these questions, and go through the questions that Ryan brought. What do you love? What do we love? I think that's a great way to frame it. What the world needs from me. You can add these perspectival nuances to the question, which I think really does deepen the inquiry in profound ways. And I would say, keep in mind as you're doing this, that not everyone has the same Aika Guy, right? I mean, these tend to be very unique to us and to our cosmic address and to our predispositions. And B, this doesn't need to be completely integrated for you to feel good about it.
You don't have to.
Go through each of these and just sort of take note, right? What am I being paid for? What am I good at? What do I love? What does the world need? And then, the second step is to start seeing whether you can start dovetailing some of your responses to those questions a little bit more, while keeping in mind that this is again, a lifetime arc. And there's no pressure for you to hit that bullseye in the very center. But if you're struggling with an overall sense of meaninglessness, if you're struggling with that, again, just find an anchor in any one of these. Just find an anchor and focus on it. And then ask yourself how you can start sort of cultivating wherever your anchor falls on this map. How can you start cultivating that and sort of allowing it to overflow into these other dimensions?
Yeah. I'd love for this graph is if all the circles were moving a little bit in spinning, there'd be the sense of like how this is an alive lifetime process to it. Yeah. So if you can imagine that. And Corey, maybe we can include a link to the meditation I have for the basic embodiment. So that way, if people want to practice so they can do that.
For sure. Well,
cool.
We have it.
Well, that was fun.
Meaning.
Hope that was meaningful.
We have some now.
A few people.
And again, I would invite everyone who's watching this, let us know what questions you have. Just submit them in the comments right below. Ryan and I will read them on the air. and get back to you. I've been very happy, Ryan, that the shows that we've done so far have just been so well received. I feel like we're doing something kind of special and a little bit different here, and it's been nice.
Yeah, and speaking of meaning, I've really felt that from people who shared their comments. It really reflected back that this was meaningful, and it really fuels me too, and I love that we're doing this.
Yeah, same, brother.
Cool.
Well, this has been awesome, my friend.
Yes, likewise. Looking forward to the next one in October.
Episode 4.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, buddy.
All right,
well,
man.
In the meantime, thanks for joining us, everyone. My name's Corey deVos. That's Ryan Oelke. Say bye, Ryan.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye, guys.